When billionaire entrepreneur Alexander Reed hires a young, struggling woman, Sophie Bennett, as a nanny for his troubled son, he has no idea that her calm demeanor and gentle ways hide a secret from her past. Sophie quickly becomes indispensable to the family, helping Alexander's withdrawn son, Liam, open up and rediscover joy. But as Sophie's influence grows, questions arise about her background. Why does she avoid discussing her family? Why does she flinch at certain questions? And what happens when Alexander discovers the shocking truth that ties Sophie's life to his in ways he could never have imagined? Alexander Reed was a man who seemingly had it all: wealth, power, and a sprawling estate that overlooked the city. His name was synonymous with success, his business empire unmatched. Yet for all his accomplishments, Alexander felt a void in his life, one that no amount of money could fill. It had been 2 years since the untimely death of his wife Claire, and their 7-year-old son Liam had not been the same since. Once a bright and curious child, Liam had withdrawn into himself, refusing to speak to anyone, not even his father. Alexander, despite his best efforts, felt helpless. He tried therapy, expensive tutors, and even the most exclusive childcare services, but nothing seemed to reach his son. One rainy morning, as Alexander sat in his home office, staring out at the gray skies, his assistant, Linda, entered the room. She held a folder in her hands, her expression a mix of hope and hesitation. "Mr. Reed," she began cautiously, "I've found someone who might be a good fit for Liam. Her name is Sophie Bennett. She's young, has experience working with children, and, well, her references are glowing." Alexander barely glanced at the folder. "Another nanny? What makes her different from the others?" he asked, his tone weary. Linda hesitated, then said, "She has a way with children who've experienced trauma. Her last employer said she helped their son, who had been through a similar situation, open up again. I think she might be exactly what Liam needs." Reluctantly, Alexander opened the folder, scanning. There wasn't much to it. No prestigious degrees, no extensive experience working with high-profile families. But there was something about her face in the attached photograph, something in her kind eyes and warm smile, that made him pause. "Fine," he said finally. "Set up a meeting." Sophie Bennett arrived at the Reed estate a few days later, nervous but determined. She was a petite woman in her mid-20s with soft brown hair that fell in waves around her shoulders, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets she wasn't ready to share. Her clothes were simple but neat, a stark contrast to the opulence of the estate. Linda greeted her warmly and led her into the grand living room where Alexander sat waiting. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit and piercing blue eyes giving him an air of authority that made Sophie's heart race. She had read about him in magazines, seen his face on billboards, but meeting him in person was an entirely different experience. "Mr. Reed, this is Sophie Bennett," Linda said, gesturing toward Sophie. Sophie extended her hand, her smile polite but reserved. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Reed." Alexander shook her hand, his gaze assessing. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice cool but not unkind. "I won't waste your time. Liam has been through a lot, and I need someone who can connect with him, someone who can help him find his way back to being the boy he used to be. Do you think you can do that?" Sophie met his gaze, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I can't promise miracles, Mr. Reed, but I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to help Liam. I've worked with children who've faced loss, and I know how important patience and understanding are." Her honesty seemed to catch Alexander off guard. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You'll start tomorrow." The next morning, Sophie began her new job. Liam was a small, fragile-looking boy with messy blonde hair and sad, distant eyes. He sat on the floor of his room, surrounded by toys he didn't seem interested in. Sophie approached him slowly, her voice soft and gentle. "Hi, Liam," she said, sitting down a few feet away from him. "My name's Sophie. I'm going to be spending some time with you. I thought we could play a game, but only if you want to." Liam didn't respond, didn't even look at her. Sophie didn't push him. Instead, she picked up a toy truck and began rolling it back and forth, humming a soft tune. For the first time in months, Liam glanced up, watching her with faint curiosity. Day by day, Sophie worked to build trust with Liam. She spoke to him without expecting a response, read him stories, and played with his toys as if he weren't even in the room. Slowly, he began to engage, first by watching, then by imitating her movements, and finally by speaking in quiet, hesitant sentences. Alexander watched these interactions from a distance, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and guilt. He had been so focused on his grief, on trying to maintain control of his life and his business, that he had failed to see how deeply his son was suffering. Seeing Sophie connect with Liam, seeing his son smile for the first time in years, made him realize how much he had neglected what truly mattered. One evening, after Liam had fallen asleep, Alexander found Sophie in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea. He hesitated in the doorway, then stepped inside, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "Liam, he's different with you. I've seen changes in him that I didn't think were possible." Sophie looked at him, her eyes warm but guarded. "Liam's a wonderful boy," she said softly. "He just needed someone to listen, to be patient with him. He's the one doing the hard work. I'm just here to support him." Alexander nodded, his gaze lingering on her. There was something about Sophie that intrigued him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. She was kind, patient, and unassuming, but there was also a depth to her, a sense that she had her own struggles, her own pain that she wasn't ready to share. "Why do you do this?" he asked suddenly. "Why work with children who've been through so much? It can't be easy." Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering with emotion. "Because I know what it's like," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it's like to feel lost, to need someone to believe in you, and I want to be that person for others." Alexander wanted to ask more, but something in her expression stopped him. He realized that Sophie was carrying her own burdens, her own secrets, and he wasn't sure if he had the right to pry. But as the days turned into weeks and Sophie's bond with Liam grew stronger, Alexander found himself wanting to know more about her, to understand the woman who had brought light back into his son's life, and into his own. What he didn't realize was that the answers he sought would come sooner than he expected, and they would change everything he thought he knew. The following weeks saw remarkable changes in the Reed household. Liam, who had once been withdrawn and silent, was now a boy rediscovering his voice and his smile. He began engaging with Sophie more openly, asking questions, playing games, and even laughing, a sound that had been absent from the mansion for far too long. Alexander watched these transformations with a mixture of awe and gratitude, yet he couldn't shake the growing curiosity he felt toward Sophie. Sophie's impact on Liam was undeniable, but there were moments when Alexander noticed a shadow cross her face, a flicker of something unspoken. She was kind and patient, but she kept her past guarded, deflecting questions with practiced ease. Whenever Alexander or Linda brought up her background, Sophie would offer polite but vague answers, quickly steering the conversation elsewhere. One evening, as Alexander and Sophie sat in the living room reviewing Liam's progress in school, Alexander decided, "Sophie," he began, his tone casual, "you've been incredible with Liam. I've never seen anyone connect with him the way you have. But I have to admit, I'm curious. What made you choose this path? Working with children like Liam?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes dropping to the notebook in her lap. She ran her fingers over the edge of the page, as if debating how much to reveal. "I've always felt drawn to helping children," she said softly. "I guess you could say it's personal for me." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing. "Personal? Did something happen in your past?" Sophie glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before looking away. "Everyone has a past, Mr. Reed," she said with a small, tight smile. "But I don't think it's relevant. What matters is Liam, and what we can do to help him." Alexander nodded, sensing that pressing her further would only push her away. But the curiosity lingered. growing stronger with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's past held answers that might explain her uncanny ability to connect with Liam, and perhaps even the reason she had come into their lives. Meanwhile, Liam's progress continued to improve. One afternoon, Sophie suggested they go for a walk in the estate's expansive garden. As they strolled through the neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flowers, Liam reached for Sophie's hand, his. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice steady but hesitant, "do you have a family?" The question caught Sophie off guard. She stopped walking, her gaze fixed on the boy's earnest face. "I used to," she said softly. "But things didn't work out the way I hoped." Liam tilted his head, his curiosity evident. "What happened?" Sophie knelt down so she was at eye level with him, her expression tender. "Sometimes, Liam, people make mistakes. And sometimes, life doesn't go the way we plan. But that doesn't mean we stop hoping for something better." Liam nodded thoughtfully, his grip on her hand tightening. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "You make everything better." Sophie felt her heart swell, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She hugged Liam tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You make everything better too, Liam." That evening, Alexander stood by the window in his study, watching Sophie and Liam as they played in the garden. He couldn't deny the warmth that had returned to his home, the way Sophie had brought his son back to life. But he also couldn't ignore the growing questions in his mind. Who was Sophie Bennett? And what was she hiding? His thoughts were interrupted by Linda, who entered the room with a folder in her hands. Her expression was serious, her tone cautious as she spoke. "Mr. Reed, I think you'll want to see this." Alexander took the folder, his brow furrowing as he opened it. Inside were documents, background checks, references, and a few photographs. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary, but as he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A discrepancy in Sophie's references. One of her previous employers had listed her under a different name, Sophie Marshall. "What is this?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. Linda hesitated, then said, "It seems Sophie may have used a different name and—" I dug a little deeper and I found this. She handed him a photograph, a picture of a younger Sophie standing outside a modest house with a man and a child. The man's face was blurred, but the child bore a striking resemblance to Liam. Alexander stared at the photograph, his heart pounding. "Why does this boy look like Liam?" he demanded. "I don't know," Linda admitted. "But I thought you should see it." The next morning, Alexander confronted Sophie in the kitchen, holding the photograph in his hand. "Sophie," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Who is this?" He held up the photograph, his eyes searching hers for answers. Sophie froze, her face paling as she saw the image. Her hands trembled as she set down the mug of tea she had been holding. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter where I got it," Alexander said. "What matters is the truth. Who is this boy, and why does he look like Liam?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she spoke. "His name is Noah," she said softly. "He's my son." Alexander felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He stared at Sophie, his mind racing. "Your son?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide this from me?" Sophie looked down, her tears spilling over. "Because I didn't think you'd understand," she said. "Noah, he's gone, Mr. Reed. I lost him years ago. And when I saw Liam, I saw so much of Noah in him. I just wanted to help him, to be there for him in a way I couldn't be for my own son." Alexander felt a wave of emotions, shock, anger, and an overwhelming sense of empathy. He took a deep breath, his voice softening. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner, Sophie? I could have helped you." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. "Because I didn't want you to see me as broken," she said. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't do my job. I just wanted to make a difference, for Liam." And for myself, Alexander stepped closer, his expression softening. You have made a difference, Sophie, more than you know, but you don't have to carry this alone anymore. Let me help you. Sophie nodded, her tears falling freely as she whispered, Thank you. And in that moment, Alexander realized that Sophie's presence in their lives was no coincidence. She had come into their world carrying her own pain, her own secrets, but she had also brought healing, love, and hope. And as they stood there, both of them vulnerable and open, Alexander knew that their journey was only just beginning. The revelation of Sophie's past lingered in the air like a storm cloud, transforming the dynamic within the Reed household. Alexander spent the next few days processing what he had learned. Sophie's secret, her loss, her pain, and her connection to Liam explained so much about her patience, her tenderness, and her ability to reach his son. But it also raised new questions. What had truly happened to her son, Noah? And why did she carry this burden alone? For her part, Sophie continued her work with Liam, but the air between her and Alexander was thick with unspoken words. She could sense his curiosity, his concern, but she was too afraid to open up further. What would he think if he knew the full truth? Would he still trust her, or would he see her as damaged, incapable, unworthy of the role she had come to cherish? One evening, after Liam had gone to bed, Alexander found Sophie sitting on the back patio, staring out at the garden. The moonlight illuminated her face, highlighting the weariness in her expression. He stepped outside, his footsteps soft against the stone. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice gentle. Sophie glanced up, startled, then nodded. Of course. Alexander sat beside her, the silence between them stretching for a moment before he spoke. Sophie, I need to know. What happened to Noah? Her breath hitched, and she looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, Alexander thought she might deflect again, but then she sighed, her voice trembling as she began to speak. Noah was my everything, she said softly. He was kind, curious, and so full of life. But his father wasn't the man I thought he was. He was controlling, manipulative. When I finally found the courage to leave, I thought I could give Noah a better life, but... She paused, tears streaming down her face. Alexander waited, his heart aching for her, his own emotions raw as he listened. We were in a car accident, Sophie continued, her voice breaking. It was late, and I was driving us to a new town, to a fresh start. The roads were slick and I lost control. Noah, he didn't make it. Alexander felt his chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. Sophie, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. Sophie nodded, her hands trembling. I blame myself for so long, I still do sometimes. But when I saw Liam, when I saw how much he needed someone, I felt like I had a second chance. A chance to make a difference, to help him in a way I couldn't help Noah. Alexander reached out, placing a hand on hers. You've done so much for Liam, he said softly. You've brought him back to life, Sophie. And I can see now that you've done it out of love, not just for him but for the boy you lost. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Do you really think so? I know so, Alexander replied, his voice firm. And I want you to know that you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We're a team, Sophie. We can face this together. As the days passed, Sophie's bond with Liam grew even stronger. He began to open up about his mother, sharing memories that had once been too painful to speak aloud. Sophie listened with patience and understanding, her own pain giving her the empathy to help Liam navigate his grief. Alexander, too, found himself drawn closer to Sophie. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the way she had turned her pain into something beautiful. He saw in her not just a nanny, but a kindred spirit, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss and come out the other side with a heart still capable of love. One afternoon, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Liam turned to Sophie, his expression thoughtful. Sophie, do you think my mom would be proud of me? Sophie smiled, her eyes misting over. "Oh, Liam," she said gently. "I know she would. She loved you so much and she would be so proud of the boy you've become." Liam nodded, his gaze turning to his father. "And you, Dad?" Alexander leaned forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Every single day," he said firmly. "I'm proud of you, Liam, and I know your mom would be too." That evening, as Alexander walked Sophie to her car, he found himself hesitating. There was something he wanted to say, something that had been building inside him for weeks. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I just wanted to thank you, not just for what you've done for Liam, but for what you've done for me. You've brought something back into this house that I thought was gone forever. You've brought hope." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's been a gift to be here," she said softly. "You and Liam, you've given me a purpose again, and for that, I'll always be grateful." As their eyes met, Alexander felt a connection that went beyond words, a shared understanding of loss, of healing, and of the power of love to transform even the darkest of moments. He realized in that moment that Sophie had not only changed Liam's life, she had changed his too. But just as the Reed family began to settle into this new chapter, an unexpected visitor arrived at the mansion, bringing with them a piece of Sophie's past that she thought she had left behind. A man stepped out of a sleek black car, his expression cold and calculating as he approached the front door. Sophie's heart sank as she saw him, her breath catching in her throat. It was Noah's father. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The man smirked, his gaze flicking to Alexander, who had stepped outside to see what was happening. "I'm here to talk," he said smoothly. "You've got a good thing going here, Sophie. It'd be a shame if someone were to disrupt it." Alexander stepped forward, his expression protective and unyielding. "If you've come to threaten her, you're wasting your time," he said firmly. "She's not alone anymore." The man's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "I'll be back." As the man walked away, Sophie turned to Alexander, her eyes wide with fear. "I thought I left him behind," she whispered. "I thought I was finally free." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on Achu. "You are free, Sophie," he said firmly, "and I won't let him take that away from you. We'll face this together." The unexpected reappearance of Noah's father, Daniel, cast a shadow over the newfound harmony in the Reed household. For Sophie, his arrival brought back memories she had fought so hard to bury, memories of manipulation, fear, and heartbreak. For Alexander, it ignited a fierce determination to protect the woman who had become so vital to his and Liam's lives. But Daniel's threat lingered. He didn't immediately return, yet his presence loomed over Sophie like a storm cloud. She found herself glancing over her shoulder, her anxiety mounting with each passing day. Alexander noticed her unease and knew that ignoring the issue was not an option. One morning, as Sophie prepared breakfast, Alexander entered the kitchen, his expression resolute. "Sophie," he began, his tone steady, "I've spoken to my legal team. They've advised me on how to handle Daniel if he tries anything. You don't have to face him alone." Sophie paused, her hands trembling slightly as she set down a plate. "I don't want to drag you and Liam into this," she said softly. "It's my problem, and I don't want it to affect your family." Alexander stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "You are part of this family, Sophie, and families don't abandon each other. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Sophie allowed herself to feel the warmth of support. She nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you, Alexander." Meanwhile, Liam continued to thrive under Sophie's care. The boy, once shy and withdrawn, was now bursting with curiosity and energy. He excelled in school, began making friends, and even picked up painting, a hobby he and Sophie shared during quiet afternoons in the garden. One day, as they worked on their respective canvases, Liam looked up at Sophie, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think my mom would have liked you?" he asked innocently. Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I think she would have been proud of you for how far you've come," she said gently. "And I like to think she would have liked me too." Liam nodded, satisfied with her answer, and returned to his painting. Moments like these reminded Sophie why she had taken this job, why she had chosen to stay despite the challenges. Liam had given her a sense of purpose, a reason to hope again. Alexander, too, found himself leaning on Sophie in ways he hadn't expected. Her presence brought warmth to his home, but it also stirred feelings he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge since Claire's passing. Sophie wasn't just Liam's nanny. She was a source of strength, kindness, and light in their lives. He often found himself drawn to her, seeking her perspective on everything from Liam's progress to the burdens of his business. One evening, as they shared a quiet moment in the study, Alexander broke the silence. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly for what you've done for Liam," he said, his voice soft. "You've given him back a piece of himself I thought was lost forever." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with sincerity. "It's not just me," she said. "You've been there for him every step of the way. He knows how much you love him, Alexander. That's what makes the difference." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with unspoken emotion. But before either of them could speak, the sound of a car engine outside broke the moment. Daniel had returned. Sophie's breath caught as she saw him step out of his car, his expression smug and confident. He carried a folder under his arm, which he waved mockingly as he approached the front door. Alexander was at her side in an instant, his jaw clenched, his protective instincts kicking in. When Daniel knocked, Alexander opened the door, his imposing presence filling the doorway. "What do you want?" he demanded. Daniel smirked, holding up the folder. "Just thought you'd like to see this," he said, handing it over. "It's proof that Sophie isn't who she says she is. Do you really know the kind of person you've let into your home?" Alexander opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. They contained fragments of Sophie's past, her legal name change, a restraining order she had filed against Daniel, and details of her involvement in the accident that had claimed Noah's life. While none of the information painted Sophie in a negative light, Daniel had framed it to look incriminating. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my past, and I'm not ashamed of it. You can't hurt me with it anymore." Daniel's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that," he said. "I have ways of making people listen. And if you think I'm going to let you get away with taking everything from me, you're wrong." Alexander stepped between Sophie and Daniel, his voice cold. "You need to leave. Now. If you come back, I'll make sure you regret it." Daniel hesitated, his confidence wavering under Alexander's unwavering gaze. Finally, he turned and walked away, his threats hanging in the air like a dark cloud. After Daniel's departure, Sophie broke down, the weight of the confrontation finally overwhelming her. Alexander pulled her into a protective embrace, his voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe here, Sophie," he said. "I won't let him hurt you." As the days passed, Alexander and Sophie worked together to ensure that Daniel could know. Alexander's legal team obtained a restraining order, and the mansion's security was tightened. Slowly, Sophie began to feel a sense of safety and stability return. One evening, as Sophie sat in the garden watching Liam play, Alexander joined her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You've been through so much, Sophie," he said. "And yet you've given so much to Liam, to this family. I don't know how to thank you." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "You already have," she said softly. "You gave me a second chance, a chance to be part of something meaningful, and that means more to me than you'll ever know." Alexander reached for her hand, his voice gentle. "You're not just part of something, Sophie. You've become part of our family." Her heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in years, Sophie felt truly at peace. She had faced her past, stood up to her fears, and found a place where she belonged. And as she looked at Alexander and Liam, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. As the days passed, the Reed household found a semblance of peace. Daniel had been legally barred from coming near Sophie or the estate, and the family began to settle back into their routines. Liam's joy returned, Sophie's confidence grew, and Alexander found himself looking forward to their time together more than he cared to admit. But as much as they tried to move forward, Daniel's parting words hung in the air like an ominous shadow. Alexander remained vigilant, doubling security measures and ensuring that Sophie was never alone when leaving the estate. Despite these precautions, the tension was palpable, and Sophie found herself grappling with an unshakable sense of unease. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Liam broke the quiet with a question. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "why does Sophie seem so sad sometimes?" Sophie's hand froze mid-reach for her glass, her heart clenching at Liam's perceptiveness. She looked at Alexander, unsure how to respond. Alexander set down his fork and met his son's gaze. "Sophie has been through some tough times, buddy," he said gently. "But she's one of the strongest people I know." Liam turned to Sophie, his expression earnest. "Are you sad because of that man who came here?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes misting over as she looked at the boy who had come to mean so much to her. "A little," she admitted softly. "But I'm also happy, Liam. Happy to be here with you and your dad. You both make me feel safe." Liam smiled, satisfied with her answer, and returned to his meal. Alexander watched the exchange, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and admiration for Sophie's courage. But the peace they had worked so hard to achieve was shattered one fateful night. It was late, the estate quiet, when the alarms blared to life. Alexander was the first to react, grabbing his phone and rushing toward the security monitors. Sophie, startled awake by the noise, hurried to Liam's room, her heart pounding in her chest. "What's happening?" she asked breathlessly as Alexander met her in the hallway, his expression grim. "Daniel," he said through clenched teeth. "He's breached the perimeter." Sophie's blood ran cold. "What does he want?" she whispered, fear gripping her. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He won't get anywhere near you or Liam. Stay with him. I'll handle this." Sophie nodded, her heart racing as she hurried to Liam's room. She found the boy sitting on his bed, wide-eyed and clutching his favorite stuffed animal. "It's okay, Liam," she said, pulling him into her arms. "You're safe. I promise." Outside, Alexander confronted Daniel near the gate, flanked by 2 security guards. Daniel's face was twisted with rage, his voice slurring slightly, a clear indication that he had been drinking. "You think you can keep her from me?" Daniel spat, his words venomous. "You think you can just erase the past?" Alexander stood firm, his tone icy. "Sophie doesn't belong to you. She's free from whatever control you think you still have. Leave now, or you'll regret it." Daniel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You have no idea who she really is, do you? No idea what she's capable of?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I know enough to trust her, and I know enough to see that you're a coward who preys on others to feel powerful. It ends here." At Alexander's signal, the guards moved to escort Daniel off the property. He resisted at first, shouting threats and obscenities, but eventually he was forced to leave, his anger echoing into the night. Back inside, Alexander found Sophie and Liam sitting together in the boys' room. Sophie looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "He's gone," Alexander said softly, his voice reassuring. "He won't hurt you." Sophie nodded, her hands still trembling as she held Liam close. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Alexander knelt beside her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to face this alone anymore, Sophie. I'm here. We're here." Liam, sensing the tension, looked at Sophie with wide, innocent eyes. "Are we a family now?" he asked quietly. Sophie's breath caught, tears spilling over as she hugged him tightly. "Yes, Liam," she said softly. "We're a family." Alexander reached for Sophie's hand, his touch gentle but firm. "And families protect each other," he said, "no matter what." The confrontation with Daniel marked a turning point for the Reed family. Sophie no longer felt like an outsider in their home. She felt like she belonged. And Alexander, who had spent so long guarding his heart, found himself opening up to the possibility of love again. One evening, as they sat together on the patio, Alexander turned to Sophie, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed everything," he said softly. "Not just for Liam, but for me. I didn't think I could feel this way again, but you've shown me that it's possible." Sophie looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "You've changed my life too, Alexander," she said. "You and Liam, you've given me a family, something I thought I'd never have again." Their eyes met, and in that moment the bond between them deepened, unspoken yet undeniable. They had faced the storm together and come out stronger, bound by love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. The days following Daniel's final confrontation brought a renewed sense of peace and stability to the Reed household. Sophie, Alexander, and Liam settled into a rhythm that felt effortless, as though they had always been a family. The looming threat of Daniel was no longer a shadow over their lives, thanks to Alexander's legal team and the enhanced security measures that ensured he couldn't come near them again. For Sophie, the mansion no longer felt like just a place of work. It felt like home. She had found not only safety within its walls, but also a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since losing Noah. Liam had become like a son to her, and Alexander, well, her feelings for him were something she was still coming to terms with. She often found herself marveling at the man beneath the billionaire exterior, a father who adored his son, and a protector who had stood by her through her darkest moments. One evening, as they gathered in the living room after dinner, Liam held up a handmade card he had been working on. "I made this for you, Sophie," he said, grinning proudly. Sophie took the card, her eyes misting over as she read the child's carefully written words. "Thank you for making our house feel like a home. Love, Liam." Her throat tightened as she hugged him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Liam. This means more to me than you'll ever know." Alexander watched the exchange, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He had seen the way Sophie had transformed their lives, how she had brought light back into their home and helped Liam rediscover his joy. And somewhere along the way, she had done the same for him. That weekend, Alexander surprised Sophie and Liam with a day trip to the countryside. He had arranged for a picnic by a serene lake surrounded by lush greenery, a place where they could relax and enjoy each other's company, away from the pressures of daily life. As they sat on a blanket, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the scene, Liam skipped stones across the water while Sophie and Alexander watched. The tranquility of the moment was almost surreal, a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured just weeks earlier. "You've given him so much," Alexander said quietly, his gaze fixed on Liam. "More than I ever could have on my own." Sophie shook her head, her voice soft. "You've always been there for him, Alexander. He knows how much you love him, and that's what matters most." Alexander turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "And what about you, Sophie? Have we given you enough?" Sophie hesitated, her heart racing at the weight of his words. "You've given me more than I ever expected," she admitted. "I came here thinking I could help Liam, but I never imagined I'd find so much for myself." Alexander reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "You're part of this family now, Sophie, and I want you to know that you always will be." Her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Thank you, Alexander, for everything." In the weeks that followed, Sophie and Alexander's bond deepened. They worked together to create a home where Liam could thrive, but it wasn't just about the boy anymore. It was about the life they were building as a family. Sophie's role in the household evolved beyond that of a nanny. She became a partner, a confidant, and, increasingly, the center of Alexander's thoughts. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Alexander took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through. About you, about Liam, about us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. "What is it?" she asked gently. Alexander reached for her hand, his gaze unwavering. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, someone who could bring so much light and love into our lives. You've given me and Liam something I didn't think was possible after Claire, and I can't imagine our lives without you." Her breath caught, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, "Alexander, I know this isn't something we have to rush," he continued, his voice filled with sincerity, "but I want you to know how much you mean to me, how much I care about you, and how much I want to see where this could go." Sophie's heart swelled with emotion as she met his gaze, her voice trembling. "I care about you too, Alexander. More than I ever thought I could." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared feelings settling over them like a warm embrace. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something beautiful, something that promised to grow stronger with time. The months turned into years, and the Reed household continued to flourish. Liam grew into a bright, confident young man, his laughter echoing through the halls of the mansion. Sophie and Alexander's relationship deepened, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and a shared love for the boy who had brought them together. On Liam's 10th birthday, the family gathered in the garden for a small celebration. As Liam blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by friends and laughter, Sophie and Alexander stood side by side, their hands intertwined. "Look at him," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with pride. "He's so happy." Alexander squeezed her hand, his gaze filled with warmth. "That's because of you," he said. "You've given him, and me, so much more than I ever thought possible." Sophie smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a second chance," she said, "and that's all I've ever wanted." As the sun set over the garden, casting a golden glow over the scene, the family stood together, united by love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. They had faced their challenges, overcome their fears, and found their way to a place of healing and joy. And as Sophie looked at Alexander and Liam, she knew that she had finally found her home, not just in the mansion, but in the hearts of the family she had come to cherish. Together they were stronger, happier, and ready to face whatever the future held, side by side as a family. 5 years later, the Reed estate stood as a testament to the love and resilience that had transformed it from a place of solitude into a vibrant family home. The once silent halls were now filled with laughter, music, and the hum of life. The gardens, which had served as a sanctuary for Sophie and Liam during their toughest days, now hosted frequent gatherings, celebrations, and moments of quiet reflection. Sophie sat in the studio she had set up on the estate, a place where she could paint, sketch, and lose herself in her art. The room was filled with canvases, each one telling a piece of her story, the hardships she had faced, the love she had found, and the family that had given her a second chance at happiness. One painting in particular held her gaze. It was a portrait of Liam, now 12 years old, standing in the garden with his arms outstretched, the sunlight casting a golden glow around him. It captured the essence of his transformation, a boy who had once been lost in grief but had found his way back to joy. As Sophie added the finishing touches to the painting, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway, a warm smile on his face. "You're incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Every time I see your work, I'm reminded of how much you've brought to our lives." Sophie set down her brush, her cheeks flushing. "I couldn't have done any of this without you and Liam," she said softly. "You've both given me more than I ever thought possible." Alexander stepped closer, his expression serious but filled with tenderness. "And you've given us everything," he said. "Not just your talent or your kindness, but your heart." Later that evening, the family gathered in the garden for dinner. the sky painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun set. Liam, now a confident and curious young man, regaled them with stories from school, his enthusiasm infectious. Sophie and Alexander listened, their smiles reflecting the pride they felt for the boy who had become the center of their world. As the conversation wound down, Liam excused himself to play with the dog, leaving Sophie and Alexander alone under the soft glow of the garden lights. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, his tone thoughtful, "about everything we've been through." "Everything." Sophie tilted her head, her heart fluttering at the intensity in his gaze. "What about it?" Alexander reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "You've changed my life, Sophie. You've changed Liam's life. And I want to make this official, to make us a family in every sense of the word." Sophie's breath caught as Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple yet elegant ring, the diamond sparkling in the light. "Sophie Bennett," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she looked at Alexander, her heart swelling with love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes misting over. "You've given us so much, Sophie," he said softly, "and I want to spend the rest of my life giving that back to you." The wedding was a simple yet elegant affair, held in the garden that had become the heart of their home. Friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of two souls who had found each other through adversity, creating a love that was unbreakable. Liam stood proudly by their side, beaming as he watched his father and Sophie exchange vows. For him, it was a moment of complete happiness, a moment that solidified the family he had always dreamed of. As Sophie and Alexander shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause, the air filled with joy and love. Sophie looked at Alexander, her heart full as she whispered, "This is everything I've ever wanted." Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "And it's just the beginning." Years later, the Reed estate remained a place of love and connection. Sophie continued to create art, her paintings now celebrated in galleries across the country. Alexander's business thrived, but his greatest pride was the family he had built. And Liam, now a young man, carried with him the lessons of resilience, kindness, and the power of love. On quiet evenings, the family would sit together in the garden, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple joy of being together. They had faced their challenges, overcome their fears, and created a life filled with hope and happiness. As the sun set over the estate, casting a golden glow over the family, Sophie knew that she had finally found her place in the world, not just as a nanny or an artist, but as a wife, a mother, and a woman who had learned to embrace the beauty of life, love, and second chances. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they were a family, and together, they would face whatever the future held, with courage, love, and the unshakable bond that had brought them to this moment.